Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. For some of you, if you're coming from the East Coast, like I am, it's the very start of your day, 9 a.m. So thank you so much for kicking off and joining us first thing in the morning. For all of you also joining from around the world, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this session, just like to quickly review two items. Our code of conduct. So Microsoft Reactor just seeks to provide a respectful environment for both you, our audience, and our presenters. So we just ask that you're mindful in the chat, remaining professional and on topic. If this is your first time tuning in on YouTube for a live stream, you do need to have your account set up there on YouTube to interact in the chat. That's where you would ask your questions, drop comments, so on and so forth. So if you don't have an account yet, I do highly recommend doing so. Otherwise, you can watch the video, and worst case scenario, if you do have questions, you can always reach out to one of your Reactor locations, and we can follow up with the speaker afterwards. So today's session, today we are joined by Josh Garverick. He will be covering portable development environments. This is the first session. There'll be a follow-up session next week that I'll quickly speak about fault-driven development. So if you're available, come back, check it out. I'll let Josh speak more to the point of that. I will get him up on the screen now. Just bear with me momentarily. Hello, Josh. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're at.
Thank you. Thank you. So today is portable development environment. So I'll pull your screen up and I'll let you get started and start talking about yourself and about today's session.
Very good. Well, I'll keep the intros to a minimum because there's much more interesting information in here than my personal bio. Currently, I'm working with Cognizant in the Microsoft Business Group. I've written some things. I've done some training courses. I've been in the industry for a few years, so I've been around the ride a few times. Not too much aside from normal things that you'd see with industry stuff, but I'm a big time nerd when it comes to containers, and I know that that's probably something that a lot of people are like, yeah, okay, fine, containers, sure, but specifically with how these portable development environments work, this is a really cool value add for using containers to be able to be agile and be able to quickly spin up environments for developers pretty much anywhere that you can host a Docker container. So it's pretty exciting stuff. I usually like to kick off each one of these sessions with a bit of an intro as far as what brings you in today. So there may be a couple of different use cases here. You might have heard about CodeSpaces, but you haven't had a chance to look at them yet. Maybe you've tried them, but you haven't tried to use them locally, which is something that you actually can do. You may be in one of those categories where I have no idea what any of this is, but it sounds cool and I want to learn some more. So hopefully we'll be able to touch on areas for all three of these and perhaps even more as we go through the next 20-25 minutes or so. I want to start with the obvious, which is GitHub CodeSpaces. And this gives you a few different features right out of the box. So there's a notion of rapid provisioning when it comes to setting up CodeSpaces, and rapid is a relative term, so keep that in mind. It could depend on the stack that you're working with. It could be dependent upon the features that you select for your CodeSpace. You do have the ability to customize it pretty much top to bottom, left to right. So depending on how you have that set up is going to really dictate how long it takes to spin that environment up. One thing I do want to make very clear is that this is not something that you can get your hands on if you just happen to sign up for an individual account with GitHub. This is something that's available at the Teams and Enterprise Cloud level. There are associated costs with these, so that's something else to keep in mind. The links for pricing and availability and everything are at the end of this presentation, can be sent out later on as well to make sure that everyone has that. So another interesting thing that you may or may not realize is that this also allows for Docker in Docker or Docker Compose to be run online in the browser with no additional configuration. Once you spin it up and you say, I want to be able to use, Docker and Docker, it will automatically install everything that you need. And you can actually run a Docker Compose file directly from the browser, which is pretty crazy. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to run you through a real quick demo of how to do this. And if we switch over to my screen share, what you'll see is my account on GitHub, and you can see that I've forked a repository here. So this is the Node.js .org's website. So this is all the code that actually runs the main Node.js website that you would see when you go to that URL. And to get started with CodeSpaces, what you'll want to do is you'll want to go to Code. And you'll see here that I have two tabs. I have local, which is normally what you would see with your individual account. But I also have a tab for CodeSpaces. I'm currently set up in GitHub Teams, so I do have the availability to get into CodeSpaces. An interesting option that you can get into is you can create a default CodeSpace. Gives you 4 cores, 8 gig of RAM, 32 gig of storage. You can also configure and then create the CodeSpace, which gives you the ability to go in there and actually take care of setting up what you want to have installed, any additional things that you'd like to configure for your environment. For the purposes of this demo, what we're going to do is we're just going to leave it as the default, and we're going to create a CodeSpace on main. And what this is going to do is it's going to go through and set up everything that it needs to set up. You'll notice here, open this CodeSpace in VS Code desktop. If you want to click on that and open that in VS Code, you're absolutely able to do that, and that will be part of the next section that we cover. Now you'll notice that it really didn't take too terribly long, right? A few seconds, opens the repo. You can see that in the browser, you've got essentially VS Code. It's running completely online. It's managing the storage for all of the files that are within that particular repo. Another interesting thing that you can leverage is extensions. And there are profiles that allow you to install extensions across different areas. So, for example, you could have extensions installed locally on your own machine, but you could have some extensions that you have marked as being shareable, which means they will also install in CodeSpaces or anywhere else that you happen to be synchronized with your profile and want to do that. So you can see like Docker pulled in for me, for example, and we'll continue to install other extensions as it needs to, depending on what you need to accomplish and what you have installed. So you can see it's still going through and processing. So it's pulling in GitLens, all that good stuff. Now, if I wanted to just do a quick npm install to pull in any dependencies for this particular site, you can see it'll go through and do all that. And when you actually want to run and debug, you can also set up launch JSON file like you would normally with VS Code. It also gives you the ability to set up things like port forwarding. So if you want to run a Node.js application, if you want to run a Python Flask application, if you want anything that's got a UI that's going to pop up for you, even an API project that has a Swagger endpoint, for example, you can configure CodeSpaces to allow for port forwarding, which means that you can launch and debug any of those project types directly from the browser.
Hey, Josh, I've got one
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Where are the VS Code extensions specified?
Those are right underneath extensions here. So you can see how there's a couple of different sections. So there's CodeSpaces.
Do you mind zooming in or going full screen on this?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Sorry, thank you.
Let's see.
They have a follow-up question, and they've asked, how does CodeSpaces know which extensions to install?
So what it'll do is it'll take your marked extensions here. So you have the ability to actually tell it where to put the extension if you wanted to install a new one. So for example, if I wanted to do something with Java, for example, when you look to install, you can install in CodeSpaces only because you're in CodeSpaces currently. If you're in VS Code, it'll install it by default in VS Code, but you can actually flip that over so that you can install it in CodeSpaces as well. And what it does is it synchronizes your profile information. So you would have to sign in with an account to make sure that you're synchronizing between different areas. Not unlike Visual Studio, where you would sign in with your profile to allow for roaming extensions for Visual Studio. Same type of principle there.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome. So in the interest of time, since we've only got so many minutes to go through all of this stuff, what I wanted to do was pop back over to my slides real quick and give y'all a preview of dev containers. And again, this is something that's actually available. It's been available for a while, and it's something that it doesn't cost you anything other than any resources that you might use for storing your Docker images that would have those dev container definitions in them. So essentially what this is the ability to use the format of a code space, but build it and run it locally. This is particularly helpful if you have a large team or teams of developers and you want to have a consistent environment across all the teams. And you want to have an easy way for people to consume that so that it's consumable from a central source. It has all of the SDKs and it has all of the configuration settings that it needs to have. And that allows you to then store that in a registry of some kind if you want to use the GitHub registry, if you want to use Azure Container Registry, you want to use the Docker registry. There are a bunch of different options for you to store that. One thing that you will want to make sure that you do is install the remote containers extension, which is what will allow you to actually consume that as a service and be able to pull in and run dev containers directly. So interesting side note, for anyone who's using Docker for desktop, and I'm specifically going to be referencing Docker for desktop for Windows. You may notice in the dashboard that pulls up that there's an area, a blade, if you will, for dev environments. And that runs on the same principle as dev containers wherein it will create the information that you need, and it'll allow you to run those as individual development environments. So that's something else to keep in mind and play around with if you so choose. So a lot of the same features that you're going to find in CodeSpaces, you're going to see in dev containers, because at the end of the day, it's VS Code. So all of that stuff translates over. You get some additional benefits with using VS Code, like you're able to quickly rebuild and run your dev containers if you make a change to the dev container.json file or the Docker file that actually builds the image itself. Now, you might argue, well, you can also do that in CodeSpaces, which is true. I've found personally, for the things that I've worked on, that it's a tad quicker when I'm doing it locally, but that's going to, again, mileage may vary depending on what kind of stack and configuration you're using. So don't take that as 100% gospel. That's just my personal experience with it. You may find that it's quicker online, for example. But some things to keep in mind when you're testing this out in the wild, to see exactly how best teams can consume this, and what some of the different idiosyncrasies are between the two. So with that, I'm going to jump over to the next demo, which is going to show you VS Code and dev containers. And once that comes up, you'll see my VS Code window. And hopefully text is an appropriate size and all that good stuff. Again, we can go into extensions here, and you can see what all is loaded here. You can also search for extensions in the marketplace, as we talked about before. Now, in order to get this to open up a code space, what we can do is go down to the bottom right-hand corner, and you're going to see a little icon here that'll allow you to open a remote window. So you can do, in this case, I have remote SSH installed as well, but it will show you remote containers. And
Hey, Josh, I've got another question. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no worries.
If I don't see the CodeSpaces tab under Code tab, that means I need a subscription first? Asked Stephen.
That means that you need to be in GitHub Teams or GitHub Enterprise Cloud. So technically it's a subscription, but there's definitely a different plan with GitHub that you would want to get into if that's something that you want to play around with. I know for a while there was a program where they were doing beta testing with CodeSpaces for individuals. I forget if that's still active or not, though. So I would say, with a little Bing Foo, Google Foo, whatever engine you like, I would go check it out and see if there's still an availability to sign up for the beta for that, because that'll give you obviously access to it, but it'll also give it to you for no additional cost, which is always helpful when you're trying to test things out. So this is one way that you're actually able to open up a code space. So you can open a folder in a container. You can attach to something that's already running. You can bootstrap container configuration files, which is pretty cool. What we're going to do is we're going to open a folder in a container. And it would be really helpful if you actually had things running that you need. So what we'll do is make sure it's running. It should only take a moment for that to start up.
While you load that, I have someone that says that their VS Code doesn't have the button on the bottom left of their screen that brings up the remote terminal. So on VS
okay.
Code, they're missing the button on the bottom left. Do
Got
you
it.
know a workaround on that, or?
That's actually due to not having the remote containers extension installed. What I would recommend is to go ahead and install remote containers. And you may have to reload VS Code, but it should put that down in the lower left-hand corner for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
Stephen has a follow-up in regards to the CodeSpaces subscription. He said,
Sure.
I have an MSDN subscription, but that's separate, right?
Give you access to things like Visual Studio, so you'd be able to go through the different SKUs on Visual Studio, and sometimes those MSDN benefits also have the ability to pull in not for production licensing on things like OSes and different programs. So that is not something that's actually transferable over to GitHub as far as I'm aware.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, now that Docker Desktop is running, I can open up any folder I want to. I'll actually just go over to repos and I will pull in a random folder. Let's do this one. We'll use a regular Ubuntu version. We'll use the default, and here's where you can actually install the feature. So this is kind of cool, where you can go through and say, okay, give me kubectl helm and minikube. I would like to have Moby support, so Docker and Docker. You can also do Docker from Docker, .NET CLI, GitHub CLI. So there are a few different things that you can go through and pick in here. And once that's all set, you go up to OK. And what version of Docker do you want to use? Just pick the latest. Same with the CLI version. .NET, we want to go with 1.6. Kubernetes, just install latest. And you can see it's going to go through and pull that stuff down for you. So the initial buildup obviously will take a little bit longer than it perhaps would have in that CodeSpaces example that we went through a few minutes ago. But what this is also going to do is obviously pull this into your local Docker registry on your machine, so that way any additional or subsequent spin-ups will not take as long since you have all that stuff cached. So it'll show you specifically as it goes through and installs all the different prereqs and requirements for the features that you selected. And once it's all done, it will actually display you the contents of that directory. Behind the scenes, it sets up a volume essentially to allow you to run in that container, but also access the files on your file system. Again, sometimes this can take just a little bit. So while we're waiting for that, I did want to talk about one more thing. I'll flip over to the slides real quick, just to kind of round out the rest of the discussion. And there's one thing that you may have seen if you've been watching Build or seen any subsequent posts around that, and that is something called Microsoft DevBox. Now, This is currently in private preview, which means you have to actively go out and sign up for it. And there's a waiting list, so it could take a bit. But essentially what this is a rebranding of Dev Test Labs. So if you're familiar with Azure, Dev Test Labs, where you're able to set up different VM templates for different use cases, essentially this is, a reformatting or rebranding of that. Now, you can set up, different SKUs, different SDKs, whatever kind of custom images that you want to set up for use within different pools. There's a notion of pools within DevBox where you can have, a standard machine, or you can have something that's a bit more souped up, or something that's specialty for graphic design or anything like that. It gives you the ability to manage everything and look at the security of all of the different dev boxes that you have out there. And there are two things that you need to keep in mind, one of which we already talked about, which is the fact that it's a private preview. You have to go out and you have to sign up, and it may be quick, it may not be quick. It just depends on how many people are in the queue. The other one is that this is for Windows only. So you're not going to see any Mac, any Linux stuff out there. Right now, it's strictly for Windows, which, in a lot of cases, if you're used to using Visual Studio and primarily develop in a Windows environment anyway, it shouldn't be a big deal. But that is something to keep in mind. So let's flip back over to our VS Code demo. And I wanted to just show you real quick that it's going through and it's opened up the dev container. It's got all of our files in here, and I've got some pretty icons and whatnot to help discern different folder types and file types and things like that. This gives you the visibility right into the terminal output. You can also look at ports here. So if you wanted to forward a port directly from here, you can do that. Some other walkthroughs and tutorials that'll help you get started. And as you can see, it's going through and it's starting to populate some of the extensions and everything. As I say that right there, running container, and it'll show you it's running extension cache, running that list. And then it's going to start to go through and install those extensions for you. So it'll take a little bit more time just to get that set up. But honestly, all in all, it's a fairly simple experience. And now you have a Docker image that will have all of this configuration for you that you can then check in, commit and push. Showing my age there a little. You can commit and push and share that with others. And now folks can pull that down and run that dev container that you've configured and have the exact same experience as you have had putting this together and running it locally. And that exhausts what I was going to talk about today. Rebecca, are there any other questions that are hanging out in chat?
Yeah, so Maurice, who was asking earlier about some of the extensions, asked, so remote container extensions is intended to be used with CodeSpaces, or those two separate products?
They're complementary. So you can install remote containers and not use CodeSpaces, which would be the local experience that we just went through here. Remote containers can also allow you that connectivity to CodeSpaces, which would be running obviously in GitHub hosted infrastructure. And it's basically a conduit that allows you to hook into that stuff and either access it from where it's running in GitHub or where it's running locally. So they're kind of complementary to each other as opposed to separate products.
Awesome. I think that's it on the questions thus far. You've been covering them as we've gone along. I am going to quickly, I've got my screen up. I'm going to once again call out that next week, if you want to speak to this, Josh, June 8th, the fault-driven development.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one that's near and dear to my heart, and it kind of started off as a tongue-in-cheek way to poke fun at the different -DD movements that are out there. So test-driven development, behavior-driven development, things like that. One thing that I noticed, especially that once I started to move applications into the cloud, was that there was a bit of a gap in understanding with how cloud infrastructure works and doesn't work sometimes. Whereas, on-prem, when you're developing in what we would call a traditional environment, your expectation is that infrastructure is always around, always ready, and should always be functional. With cloud, obviously, you're shifting the locus of control of that infrastructure to a provider. You may run into issues where things are not available or things don't behave the way you expect them to. And um, understanding not just error handling, but fault handling, something that occurs outside the normal execution of a program, being able to handle that and being able to handle it gracefully is something that will serve you very well, especially if you're just getting started with cloud native development. So the idea is to kind of keep faults in mind while you're developing. It looks at a couple of different design patterns that allow you to anticipate fault as well as work around it. So certain ways of handling the flow of your application and workloads that if one of them happens to not be available to process something, it's not going to completely cause the application to crash. It will simply allow for you to store that and move on. And once the service or services come back up, then things will resume and you'll be good to go. So that's kind of the background on that. Not not explicitly tied to this session, but it is something that I find is always good to go over, especially again with folks who are just starting to get into cloud native development and perhaps aren't always aware of the things that go bump in the night and the services that may experience outages and things like that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So yeah, if you're available, if you're tuning in now, if you're interested in this, we'll see you here again next week. Just FYI, I dropped a lot of links into the chat related to the session for today. I will be updating the event description to include those links for on-demand access. So if you want to tune back in on anything that was covered, we will have it available on YouTube later. And with all of these links that I've shared in the chat available for access as well. If this is your first time, if catching us, if you are not familiar with the Reactor, if you didn't come through one of our registration pages but happened to stumble upon us on YouTube, we are part of Microsoft. We put out free community workshops and sessions on a weekly basis. We're an international program, so we have events running at all different time zones all day, every day. So definitely find us on Meetup, search the location nearest you that works for your time zone. We're on YouTube, obviously. Check out all of our previous sessions on demand. You can find us on Twitter as well. Our website is temporarily down, but once that is back up and running, we will have a much easier calendar to kind of sort through, and you can sort by topics, so you can find the sessions most related and dear to you a little bit easier. That's soon to come. And then otherwise, thank you again, Josh. This was a pleasure as always.
Much appreciated. I appreciate having the time. Hopefully everyone walked away with a little bit more knowledge than they had before they started.
Exactly. That's always the goal, I think. And I mean, there was definitely some good questions there that you were able to answer. So hopefully that helped everyone out in the audience world. We're getting some thank yous coming in from some of
Excellent.
our guests. So thanks, everyone. At this point, we'll call it a day. Have a good rest of your day wherever you're tuning in from. Take care.